The Unforgivable Sin. My writings are occasionally controversial, and I am accustomed, though never entirely hardened, to receiving letters of condemnation couched in bitter terms. But then, what the heck, I sometimes write letters of condemnation myself, and although I like to think I use the rapier rather than the bludgeon, that may not be how it feels to those I condemn. So I try to be philosophical about it. There are, however, things that penetrate the philosophical armor, be it ever so well wrought and finely tempered. For instance, some time ago I received a letter from one of my peers, a member of a university faculty, who objected to certain arguments I had advanced, and did so, it would seem, on deeply intellectual grounds. He told me in his covering letter that perhaps I had better not indulge in the process of skating on thin ice, logically speaking, since apparently my reasoning abilities were not up to the task. To bear out this sad estimate of my intelligence, he offered me a dozen pages or more of his own composition, which he urged me to read. With a sigh, I set about the task. On the very first page, he struck a shrewd blow by pointing out the harm I did my readers by writing in such a way as to make them believe they understood something when, in actual fact, they did not. Quite gratuitously, he lumped Carl Sagan together with me in this vile criminality. Carl, it appeared, also lured the reader into the miserable illusion of comprehension. I read on, and it became increasingly clear that the writer was committing what was, for a writer, the unforgivable sin. He was dull and turgid, and his style was simply impenetrable. I don't say that if I read with attention and made some shrewd guesses as to what he was trying to say, I might not have gotten some shreds of nutrition out of his essay, but please, my time is reasonably valuable. I therefore stopped and composed the following postcard. Dear Dr. Blank, please forgive me, but I have no talent whatever as a linguist, and I read only English. Without a translation, I could not manage your letter. Nevertheless, I was able to make out enough to be able to assure you that you will never fall into the Asimov-Sagan trap. No one who reads what you write will ever labor under the belief he understands something. I admired that card for quite a while, for I felt I had neatly skewered my correspondent. Then, when the card had quite fulfilled its function of making me feel good, I tore it up and dumped it. I wrote no answer at all. After all, why make him feel bad? Anyone who writes like that needs no additional punishment. But why should my friend have written like that? He was undeniably intelligent. He surely knew his subject. Even granted that he had little of that intangible something called talent, surely he could marshal his arguments logically and choose his words rationally. Yet he is not alone in his sin. Read any scholarly paper, especially in the soft sciences, and you will find copious examples of unforgivably bad writing. There are numerous exceptions, thank goodness. Any one of you readers who has never tried to write a story may well write one that is bad, and yet you would probably not manage to write as badly as many high IQ scholars do. Why? In the first place, there are no economic pressures driving scholars to improve. Scholarly journals do not reject papers simply because they are badly written. It is the content that counts, muddy as that content might be. Then, too, such papers have a captive audience, since scholars must read papers by other scholars in their own field, however unrewarding the task. Yet even so, should not a scholar try to write clearly for the sake of clarity itself? Is there no pleasure to be derived from the production of a luminous sentence presenting a thought with gem-like lucidity and precision? Unfortunately not. I suspect that many a scholar doubts his own intellectual capacity, for reasons which I, not being a psychiatrist, will not puzzle over, and is eager to emphasize that capacity in the only way he knows how. He uses long words, jargon which he invents and others then adopt, spavined sentences from which broken dependent clauses hang limply, and lines of thought which meander helplessly and end nowhere. The more obscure the writing, the more the writer feels it to be the result of deep thought rather than shallow thinking, and since he dares not proclaim that the emperor has no clothes, he admires the obscurity of others. Real writers, even real writers in embryo, dare not imitate this kind of writing. For instance, 1. Never be obscure unless you wish to be subtle and elusive. Writers might choose words which have poetic or multiple connotations, and thus be obscure on the surface, yet present deeper meanings at the price of a little thought. This is a difficult thing to do, and for goodness sake don't try it unless you have a great deal of talent or experience, or better, both. 2. Therefore don't use a long word when a short word will do as well. Don't use a foreign word when an English word will do as well. Don't use a little-known word when a common word will do as well. Sometimes the long, the foreign, and the little-known must be used for good and sufficient reasons. For instance, in this particular essay I am deliberately using a more extensive vocabulary and a somewhat more involuted style than I usually do, because I do not want to give the impression that I am touting simplicity out of an inability to handle anything else. The reasons for complexity occur comparatively rarely, however, and if the arcane is inserted on every occasion, it becomes wearisome and ineffective. Play it safe. Be simple. 3. Don't imagine that if a little is good, a lot would be better. If it is sometimes colorful to use an adjective as a noun, or vice versa, don't obscure the difference between the two parts of speech altogether. If hyphenating two words makes possible an economy of expression, don't hyphenate everything in sight. You may, with justice, sprinkle some salt in your soup, but surely you would not add a tablespoonful. 4. Don't overload your sentences. Don't drag them out in the belief that short sentences are childish and long sentences are literary. Too many short sentences in a row are indeed wearisome, but it takes an admixture of not very many longer sentences to correct that, and the long sentence has to be a live one with a sturdy structure. A mere pasting together of 5 independent sentences by the omission of periods is repulsive. 5. Don't pile on the adjectives and adverbs because you feel that is the only way in which you can be descriptive. The strong words are the nouns and verbs. Make them do all the work possible, and then throw in the modifiers to do whatever little is left over. Unless you are a master or a successful poet, each modifier you include is a deadly risk. 6. I might as well add a feature of scholarly writing that will rarely tempt you. Scholars are given to the passive voice, saying, "An experiment was performed by the author that," instead of saying in a straightforward manner, "I performed an experiment that." The latter is felt to be too aggressive or immodest. The passive seems to imply a greater objectivity. Well, the devil with that. If the objectivity is there, it will remain there even if you use an I in every sentence. If the objectivity is not there, using the passive voice won't put it there. Therefore, write strongly and directly, and never be tempted to write badly just because you think it will make a good impression. The only impression it will really make is that of bad writing. Oh well, I am growing passionate, so perhaps I had better draw to a close. Let me tell you what I feel about good writing. It's important to be a good writer if you want to make a living writing, so good writing is important to me for that reason. It's important to be a good writer if you wish to make even an occasional sale, and George, Shauna, and I want as many of you as possible to make at least an occasional sale for the sake of the magazine, and that makes good writing important to all 3 of us. But there's more to it than even that. Every one of us reads far more than he will ever write. As you all know, I write, it sometimes seems to me, every waking moment. Yet even I read far more than I write, and for all of us, reading good writing is an enormous pleasure, while reading bad writing is a painful job. What's wrong, then, with wanting to enjoy life? Afterward. It frequently happens that I reread something I have written after a long enough time to make it sound fresh and new to me. I have just reread this nearly 5 years later after I wrote it. Doing so, I felt a glow of satisfaction. I desperately wanted to applaud, and only my well-known modesty kept me from doing so.